Today we are going to talk about controller versus CFO and provide a systems perspective. What's the difference? Let's talk about this question. It has often been asked, and I've been asked this question several times. What is the difference between a controller and a CFO? And more importantly, when should you bring each one into your organization? Now, most people think this is just a title difference or a seniority hierarchy. Controller reports to CFO, CFO is more senior. Simple, right? Wrong. Completely wrong. The difference between these roles are not just hierarchical, it is architectural. It's about two fundamentally different operating systems within your finance function. And if you don't understand the distinction, you will hire the wrong person at the wrong time. And it will cost you. It will cost you in cash, it will cost you in speed, and it will cost you in strategic clarity. So let me break this down from a systems perspective. The controller is your past-oriented precision engine. The CFO is your future-oriented decision architecture. Let me explain what that means. A controller exists to create accounting integrity and operational accuracy. Their job is to ensure that what happened yesterday, last week, last quarter, is recorded correctly, is reconciled completely, and is reported in compliance with GAAP or IFRS. They close the books, they manage the general ledger, they oversee accounts payable, they oversee accounts receivable, the payroll processing, they work with the auditors, they ensure your financial statements are accurate and defensible. And this is not trivial work, this is essential work. Because if you don't have clean books, you cannot raise capital, you cannot sell your company, you cannot pass an audit. You cannot even file your taxes without risk. So the controller builds a foundation of financial credibility. But here's what the controller is not optimized for. Forward-looking strategy, capital allocation decisions, business model design, scenario planning, or for that matter, cross-functional systems integration. That is where the CFO comes in. The CFO, they operate at a completely different altitude. Their job is not to record what has happened, it is to shape what happens next. They forecast, they model scenarios under uncertainty, they allocate capital across competing priorities, and they design the revenue architecture and figure out how deals are structured, how quotes will flow to cash, how performance obligations map to recognition. They partner with the CEO and the board on strategy. They assess the risks. They optimize the capital structure. They translate operational complexity into financial clarity for investors and also for the lenders and other stakeholders. The controller asks the questions, did we record this correctly? The CFO asks, should we have done this at all? Where the controller says, here's what happened last quarter, the CFO says, here is what will likely happen next quarter. And here's what we should do about it. Where the controller builds compliance, the CFO is actually building foresight. Now in a small company, let's say you're doing $2 million or $3 million in revenue. You don't need both. You probably don't even need one full-time. You need a bookkeeper and a fractional CFO who comes in periodically to help you with fundraising, to help you with financial modeling, and board reporting. But as you scale, the systems diverge, and here is where founders make a critical mistake. They hire a controller when they need a CFO, or they hire a CFO when they actually just need a controller. And the mismatch creates a lot of dysfunction. Let me give you the pattern. When you hit about $5 to $10 million in revenue, you most likely need a controller. Why? Because your transaction volume has exploded. You have got dozens of vendors, maybe even hundreds of customers. You have multiple bank accounts. You have equity compensation plans. and maybe even your first venture debt or debt facility. You need someone whose full-time job is to keep the ledger clean, close the books on time, manage the cash operations, and ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. You need operational accuracy before you need strategic foresight. And this is especially true if you're raising institutional capital or you're planning to. Because why? Because the first thing a venture firm or a bank is going to do is audit your financials. And if your books are a mess, or worse, it closes at a lower, then it'll close at a lower valuation because you've signaled operational immaturity. That's the reason you need a controller. Someone who wakes up every day thinking about recons and about month-end close and about control environments. Someone who loves systems and processes and importantly, precision. But here's what happens next. You grow. You hit 15 million or 20 million or maybe $30 million in revenue. You're thinking about your next funding round or maybe an acquisition. You're expanding into new markets. You're adding product lines. Your sales team is structuring remarkably complex deals. And your revenue model is getting more and more sophisticated. And suddenly you're facing questions that your controller cannot answer. How should we structure this partnership to optimize revenue recognition? What is a runway if we accelerate hiring in Q2? Should we raise debt or equity? What does a cash conversion cycle look like? And tell us about our working capital efficiency. How do we model dilution across the next 3 funding rounds? What does a unit economics breakdown tell us about where to allocate growth investment? These are not controller questions, these are CFO questions. And this is the moment, typically somewhere between $15 and $30 million in revenue, depending on complexity, when you need to bring in a CFO. Not to replace the controller, but to operate at a different layer of the system. Think of it this way. The controller manages the transactional layer. The CFO manages the strategic layer. The controller, he or she ensures that the machine runs cleanly. The CFO decides where the machine should go. Now here's a common failure mode. A founder hires someone with a CFO title because they want the credibility, the board presence, the strategic voice. But what they actually need is someone to close the books and manage the payroll. So they hire a strategic thinker, put them in a controller's role, and the person is miserable. They're overqualified, they're underutilized, and 6 months later they leave. Or the opposite happens. The founder hires someone with a controller background, gives them the CFO title, and then expects them to model fundraising scenarios, build 3-statement financials, or design RevOps architecture. And the person cannot do it, not because they are not smart, but because they have never operated at that altitude for a while. They have never had to think in scenarios, had to think in probabilities and strategic trade-offs. So here's a pattern you should follow. Stage 1, you are doing under $5 million in revenue. You have a bookkeeper, maybe a fractional accounting support, and a fractional CFO who helps you quarterly or during fundraising. Stage 2, you hit $5 to $10 million, you hire a full-time controller, someone who owns the close process, someone who manages the ledger, and someone who builds the operational rigor. And in stage 3, you hit $15 to $30 million, you are ready now to hire a full-time CFO, someone who owns strategy, who owns forecasting, capital allocation, and board-level financial communication. The controller now reports to the CFO. There's another stage, stage 4, where you hit $50 million plus. You might add a VP of FP&A who sits between the controller and the CFO. The controller owns the accounting for operations. FP&A owns the forecasting analysis. And the CFO, they own the strategy, the capital markets, and executive leadership. This is the natural evolution of the finance function as a system. And if you try to skip stages, let's say, or collapse roles inappropriately, you will create bottlenecks. I should say there are people who can do both though. I've been that person. Early in my career, I was essentially a controller who evolved into CFO responsibilities as the companies grew. And in smaller companies, you often need someone who can toggle between tactical execution and strategic thinking. But as organizations scale, the roles must differentiate because the cognitive load of doing both well simultaneously becomes unsustainable. So here's the other thing that people miss. Controllers and CFOs, they think differently. Controllers, they think in precision. They are detail-oriented. They are process-driven. They are focused on accuracy and compliance. CFOs think in probabilities. They are comfortable with ambiguity, with scenarios, with making decisions under uncertainty. Controllers reduce variance. You know what the CFOs do? They navigate the variance. I'm not saying either one is better. I'm just saying that they are different operating modes and your organization needs both, but you need them at the right time in the right configuration. And one more thing. If you're a founder or a CEO and you're wondering whether you need a controller or a CFO, ask yourself these questions. Do I need someone to ensure that my books are clean and my financials are audit ready? That would be a controller. Do I need someone to help me model the business, allocate capital, and advise on strategic decisions, be a great soundboard? Now that is a CFO. Am I having trouble closing my books on time, or there are a lot of reconciling accounts? There's a controller problem. On the other hand, am I having trouble forecasting accurately or understanding my unit economics? That becomes a CFO problem. Do I need to present clean financials to raise capital? Controller builds that foundation. Do I need to articulate a financial strategy that convinces investors? I know how to deploy their capital. CFO builds that narrative. The other way to think about it is that the controller is a historian. That's it. The CFO is the architect. The controller tells you what happened. The CFO helps you design what happens next. So again, both roles are mission critical. They operate at different layers of your organizational hierarchy and system. And if you bring them both in at the right time, in the right sequence, they don't just add capability, they compound it. The controller gives you credibility. The CFO gives you foresight. Together, they give you a finance function that doesn't just trust a report from the business, they actually help in shaping the business. And so that is a difference. I hope you found this short session helpful to distinguish between who is a CFO and who is a controller and how to bring them in, at what time, at what place, at what stage. And always remember, controllers are thinking in the past, the CFOs are thinking in the future. The longer your time horizon, you need a CFO. If you have short-term horizons, you can perhaps get by with a controller for a while. But either way, these are very distinct set of skills. I hope this video session was helpful. Talk to you next time.